Okay, today is our last day of notes for our River Valley Civilization unit. Today we're going to cover China. Once again, let's look at the similarities and differences between these different civilizations that we've been talking about. China is considered the oldest continuous civilization. This is due to their natural barriers, which kept them isolated for so long. And even after invasions by groups like the Mongols, China itself is still inhabited by the same ethnic group who originally began this civilization. We have a map on the left showing China as it looks today, but the area that we're talking about is much smaller. The Chinese called their land Zonggao, or the Middle Kingdom, because it was considered the center of the universe. Being surrounded by natural barriers, they didn't really know what was going on in the rest of the world while their civilization was emerging. So China was isolated from the rest of the world by natural barriers. They had the Pacific Ocean to their east. To the west, you had the Plateau of Tibet. Further west, the Himalayan mountains. North of that was the Taklamakan Desert. And to China's extreme north is the Gobi Desert. So it was very difficult for people to travel out of China or into China. You'll also need to know the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea as well. Civilization in ancient China was centered around two rivers. To the north, we have the Huanghe River, which is also called the Yellow River. We can use those interchangeably. And the southern river was the Changjiang River, but we'll call it the Yangtze River. As in Sumer, the rivers in China were unpredictable, and when they flooded, it would lead to disaster. Human lives and crops were lost in great numbers due to the floods from these two rivers. The Huanghe was so destructive that it was nicknamed the River of Sorrows. And on two different occasions, the flooding ended up killing around 1 million people each time. Today, the Chinese government have built many hydroelectric dams in order to control the flow of the river. But the positive was a very fine yellow silt, which was deposited on the banks of these two rivers. That special silt was called loess. Make sure you circle that word, you're going to need to know it. So loess allowed the Chinese to farm these lands. And this loess, which was yellow, gives these two rivers that kind of brownish, orangey color. I guess they thought it looked more like yellow. But that's where the Yellow River gets its name from. The loess would come from the deserts to the north and would be blown into the river where it would reach the bottom. And when it flooded, that's where it would reach the banks. So only 10% of the land was arable. Arable means farmable. We've covered that word before, you'll need to know it. And that was the land between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. People began living in China around 500,000 years ago. We know that because we found the remains of Peking man. Peking man happened to be a Homo erectus hominid. By 2000 BCE, the settlements finally became cities. And this happens after the rise of Sumer, Egypt, and Harappa. So remember, Sumer is our first civilization, followed by Egypt, then Harappa, finally China. China's history is divided into time periods called dynasties, based on the rule of different families. So dynastic rule, or dynasty, is when you have one family in charge of the government, and it's passed on from father to son. So the first dynasty, we're not even sure if it was a real dynasty or not, but it's called the Xia dynasty. And we think it lasted from 2000 to 1700 BCE. And it was during this time period that they learned how to farm right in this area on the Yellow River. For us, our first dynasty is the Shang dynasty, which lasted for about 700 years. They controlled the land between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And you can see that this was less than a quarter of China's total current day landmass. During the Shang dynasty, they created bronze. They had some of the most elaborate bronze work that we've seen in the ancient world. They created pottery, so we know that they were storing food and water. They developed a writing system. We called it Chinese characters. They built temples to their gods and tombs to their royals. They had a deep respect for their family, their elders, and their dead ancestors, but they lacked strong leaders. Here we have a very intricate bronze vase from the Shang dynasty. And over time, bronze will actually turn green, and that's because of the copper that's used to make bronze. The copper oxidizes and changes color as it does so. Anyang was one of the capitals of the Shang dynasty, and Chinese cities were typically built of wood. They also used clay and straw. People used the resources they have close to them. So in Egypt and in Sumer, they used sun-dried bricks. On the Indus River, they used oven-baked bricks, but in China, they would make their structures from wood. From there, they surrounded their cities with huge walls. Of course, we can think of one huge wall in China that protected the northern boundary. You're probably thinking of the Great Wall of China. We'll get to talk about that later. But cities, especially in the north, needed protection from bandits and invaders from the desert region. The Chinese had a writing system, and each character would stand for a syllable or its own idea. And we call their symbols characters. The interesting thing to note is that in China, people spoke different languages depending on where you lived. And there were actually no links between the spoken language and the written language. And even though different areas of China spoke different languages, everyone in China would use the same writing system. So to make sense of it, think about this number here. In our mind, we probably all have a word for it. For most of us, it's 2. Some people, it's going to be dos. But no matter what language you speak, when you see that numeral, you know exactly what it stands for. And that's even if it sounds different based on your language. That's how Chinese characters worked. There were an enormous number of characters. To be barely literate, you had to be able to read and understand 1,500 characters. To become a scholar, you needed to know 10,000 characters. So we have it pretty easy because we only have 26 letters, and with those letters, we can build the words that we need to use. For the Chinese, anytime they wanted to describe something new, they had to create a new character for it, and people had to memorize it. We find our oldest examples of Chinese writing on oracle bones. The writing on these bones were used by priests to predict the future. So a Shang priest would write questions addressed to the gods on animal bones or turtle shells. They would carve it into the bone or shell, and then the bone or shell was heated until it cracked. From there, the priest would interpret the cracks to try to predict the future. The idea of yin and yang comes from China as well. This idea was that there's harmony in the universe and it depended on the delicate balance of these two forces. Yin is described as being earth, dark, cold, soft, mysterious, and represents female. Yang is going to represent heaven, light, warm, hard, clear, and male. And this makes sense to me. When my birthday comes around, I tell my wife exactly what I want. But when it's time for her birthday, it's like a guessing game. I don't really, maybe I get some clues. I guess I should be listening better, but it's a mystery. But we'll see yin and yang pop up again. It also becomes the symbol for Taoism, a Chinese philosophy. Family is going to be very important to the Chinese, and respect for your parents was the number one virtue that you could have. In Chinese families, the elder male made all of the important decisions. Women were seen as inferiors, and they had to respect and obey men. If you were not married, you obeyed your father, and once you were married, you obeyed your husband. Women could move up through marriage and attain the same status as their husband, and they were given respect for having children. Another idea that we see in China is the idea of collective culture, where the group is more important than the individual. This is very different from society in the United States, where we value the individual and the idea of individualism to the utmost. Our word for the worship of your ancestors and respect for your elders is filial piety. So underline filial piety, the vocab word you're going to need to know. Family was closely linked to religion. And that's because you would worship the spirits of your dead ancestors. And you had to worship them because they could bring your family good fortune, and failure to worship them would bring disaster upon your family. The spirits themselves were not powerful gods, but instead the spirits would communicate with the actual gods for you. So we call the Chinese religion ancestor worship. And a good example of that would be Mushu from the movie Mulan. The Chinese were polytheistic, and they did have a supreme god named Shang. But for us, ancestor worship is what we will classify their religion as. The holy book for the Chinese during the Shang dynasty was called I Ching. It's known as the Book of Changes, and it was used to seek answers about the future. So we have I Ching for China. Think about the holy book for the Egyptians, what they used to help them prepare mummies for the afterlife. That was the Book of the Dead. We'll be talking about holy books throughout the year. Others include Christianity with the Bible, Judaism with the Torah, and Islam with the Quran. And we'll be talking about all of those major world religions throughout the school year. Chinese society was made up of social classes. At the top, you have a king who rules the people. Below the king are warrior nobles. We refer to them as warlords. A warlord was given a huge chunk of land by the king, and on that land, they could rule it however they saw fit. These warlords had their own personal army, and in exchange for the land that the king gave them, they promised to pay tribute in the form of military service to the king. So the king can call on the warlord for help when he is at war, and in return, the warlord gets land to rule. This is an early form of the feudal system that we'll see in other places this year, including Europe and Japan. At the bottom of society were your peasants, your farmers, and unskilled laborers. So our next dynasty is called the Zhou dynasty. It looks like it's pronounced Zhao, but it's actually pronounced Zhou. And it's around for almost 800 years. Looking at the map, this dynasty is larger than the previous Shang dynasty. And also looking at the map, you can see that at one time we spelled it a little bit differently, C-H-O-U. Over time, we've changed the way we spell things, and that's because our letters don't always correlate to the sounds of the people living in that land. And we'll see this in our World History 1 class in China. We'll also see it when we talk about the Islamic world. The Zhou dynasty was China's longest lasting dynasty. They were known for having strong conquerors who could acquire more land, but weak rulers. Once they claimed that land, they had trouble keeping it under their thumb. They also used the feudal system, like we talked about with the Shang dynasty, where nobles called warlords, would have most of the authority, but they owed military service to the ruler, the king, in exchange for that land. The Zhou dynasty invented a new system of authority called the Mandate of Heaven to justify their takeover of China. A mandate is like a command or an edict. And by referring to heaven, they mean the gods. The gods are allowing them to do this. The Zhou family says that the king is appointed by heaven, by the gods, to make sure that people are cared for. And if the king rules in a selfish or corrupt way, and they said that the Shang kings were very corrupt, then heaven withdraws its mandate and gives it to another family so that they can rule and take care of the people. So when the Shang and the Zhou families went to war and the Zhou won, by claiming the mandate of heaven, it gave the Zhou family legitimacy to rule over China. Crop failure, floods, droughts, riots, and losses in battle were all indications that a ruler had lost the mandate of heaven. So anytime life was tough on the people, it meant that another family might have the opportunity to rise up and overthrow the current ruler and claim that they had the mandate of heaven. The term dynastic cycle means the rise, fall, and replacement of dynasties, which we see throughout Chinese history. So with the dynastic cycle, we've got an old dynasty like the Shang dynasty, and they are taxing the people too much. They're not protecting the people. Infrastructure like roads are in decay, and they treat the people unfairly. And along with that, you might have problems like flooding or earthquakes. The peasants might revolt, invaders from outside might attack, and bandits could be in the countryside causing problems. So a new family would rise up and claim the mandate of heaven. They would overthrow that old dynasty. So in this case, we have the Zhou overthrowing the Shang, and this new dynasty will bring peace. They'll rebuild the infrastructure. They will make sure peasants are happy and cared for, and they protect the people. But over time, that new dynasty will become an old dynasty, and we will see the problems repeat itself until someone else emerges to rule China. In the Zhou dynasty, new roads and canals were built. Canals are huge trenches in which water flows through so that boats can use them kind of like streets. Roads and canals would stimulate trade throughout the empire. The other technological advancement would be blast furnaces, which could heat up cast iron to its melting point, and then from there they could form it to make different tools, decorations, and weapons. The Zhou dynasty was also known for this new advancement. What are we looking at in this picture? Go ahead and take 10 seconds or so. Give us your best guess. Yeah, these are the world's first coins. These coins were made from copper. They would have a hole in the center so they could be strung on cords so you wouldn't lose them. This made trade much easier. So in China, we've moved from a barter economy to a money economy. And this makes it much easier to trade. Instead of bringing all your chickens to the market to try to trade for a pig, you would just sell your chickens for these coins. Now that they've been sold, you can take the coins somewhere else and buy your pig or whatever else you need. We see the decline of the Zhou dynasty as they enter the period of warring states. What that means is that we have noble families, each led by a warlord, fighting each other for control of more territory. There was nothing the king could do to stop them because each warlord controlled his own army. And eventually the Zhou dynasty would be replaced for the Qin dynasty, which China is named for. We'll cover them in our next unit. They'll be led by Qin Shi Huangdi, one of history's most interesting figures. Not a very nice guy either. So that is it for River Valley Civilizations and for our Day of Notes.